The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Ontario's Progressive Conservative government got a shiny new 4-year majority from voters last night. Tonight, how that happened and what to watch for as all 4 parties adapt to realignments at Queen's Park. Then, our Ontario hubs reflect on what happened in their regions. And from education promises to what's driving new parties on the right, we look back on our election coverage in the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, June 3rd, and that's coming up on the agenda. For political journalists, elections are basically the playoffs. Last night, Doug Ford won the cup, but there's still plenty to reflect on from the result and what comes next. With us on that in Ontario's capital city, Robert Benzie, Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star, and Sabrina Nanji, journalist and founder of the Queen's Park Observer. Welcome all.
Hi, Dan.
Hello.
I know you guys had really long nights, so we're going to start off actually with a roll-in from this morning of Premier Doug Ford after winning the election.
Today, with the votes counted, I'm here speaking to you once again as your Premier. And I want you to know I want you to know I'll wake up every single day and go to work for all Ontarians. Whether you're a longtime supporter, voted PC for the first time, or cast your ballot for any other party. Now is the time to unite. Now is the time to build Ontario. To Andrea, Stephen, and Mike, as well as every single person who put their name on the ballot. You made our democracy stronger, and I want to thank you.
All right, something important from that clip that he didn't do last night was he thanked both Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath in his speech. But I want to get your first impressions. Sabrina, I'll start with you. What were your thoughts from the night and this morning, waking up to not really much change?
Yeah, I think we've been talking that this has been a bit of a sleepy campaign, but obviously election night was relatively explosive then. You know, we had 2 leadership resignations. Doug Ford won a resounding majority with 83 seats. We can dig into all the juicy bits there, but you know, I think I'm reading between the lines of what Ford said. You know, obviously we're all waiting for a budget now and a cabinet swearing in. I don't think there's going to be any major rush on that, maybe later on in the summer. But he seemed to kind of walk back the promise that it was going to be this exact same budget as we saw, you know, obviously, you know, the re-election platform that the PCs tabled in the spring kind of served as their budget, vice versa. But of course, technically speaking, it couldn't have been the exact same because partway through the campaign, they promised this unbudgeted raise in ODSP. And I think that a lot of people are going to be looking at Doug Ford and making sure that he's the changed Doug Ford that he has been. Like, don't forget, in the first year of his 2018 mandate, he made all these super unpopular cuts, had to demote his finance minister. And I think a lot of people are worried about that, you know, and then in the maybe 6 months or so before the campaign, they kind of changed tune, learned their lessons, you know, started talking about big spending projects. And so, you know, I think a lot of people are worried that Doug Ford might benefit from a weakened opposition as those parties are busy with choosing their new leaders. But, you know, time will tell if this is really the new Doug Ford.
All right, Robert, I'll get your take on that. First impressions.
I mean, I was struck by the new voter coalition that the Tories have built under Mr. Ford. The first Conservative government that I covered was under Mike Harris, and it was decidedly an anti-union government in many ways, mostly with teachers' unions and public sector unions, but some private sector unions part of them as well. But Mr. Ford, we've called it at the Star the big blue collar machine that he has built, which is appealing to factory workers, trades people, things like that. And then even this morning, Dan, he was talking about the importance of the nurses and teachers and how he's going to make changes to Bill 124, which of course is the wage cap bill that keeps the raises at 1%. So it struck me that he's being a lot more conciliatory, and I think it's because he's understanding that who elected him. He's not really elected by Bay Street. He's elected by more ordinary folks. Now, this is a thing about him. I mean, Mr. Ford wins some ridings that the Tories wouldn't win under another leader. And I think that's what's kind of bedeviling for the New Democrats and the Liberals. Used to count on a lot of union support. The Liberals did when they were in office for 15 straight years. The New Democrats have traditionally been very close to organized labor. That seems to have changed a little bit. Sure, Andrea Horwath still had a lot of public sector union support and teachers unions and so on. And Del Duca had, Stephen Del Duca, the Liberal leader, had to some teachers union support, but nothing like it's not like it used to be. So I think those parties are going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out how they can appeal to a broad swath of people that aren't maybe that ideological. I don't think Mr. Ford is particularly ideological. He is a populist. He wants to be loved. He wants to be liked. He wants to be reelected. So he looks at what's popular and what the polls are saying, and he moves in that direction, which sounds a lot like some liberal governments that we've seen in this country over the years that aren't ideologically driven.
All right, let's talk seat counts. The Conservatives gained 16 seats, the NDP lost 7, and the Liberals gained 1, and the Greens, of course, maintained their 1 seat. Sabrina, the NDP lost seats to the PCs and not to the Liberals. Did anyone see that coming? Was that reflected in the polls as well?
Well, if you talk to anyone in the Conservative war room, I mean, yeah, they definitely were banking on Windsor, and they did it. You know, they picked up Essex and Windsor-Tecumseh, where obviously, you know, those ridings were a little bit more in play, traditional NDP territory, but 2 incumbents didn't run again, Taras Natyshak and Percy Hatfield. You know, and so obviously incumbents get a leg up on the ticket. There's name recognition. They can run on their record. But the Conservatives were really pushing hard in those ridings. I think Ford even said it in question period at one point, you know, like, we're coming for you, to Taras Natyshak. And, you know, they had nominated their candidates there months before others. So, like, that gave their candidates time to go door knock, you know, really, like, push a hard ground game. I think more surprising to me was probably the North. They picked up Thunder Bay Atikokan, a historic win for the Conservatives. Again, traditionally NDP turf, and also Timmins, too, you know, where longtime incumbent NDPer Gilles Bisson lost his seat. I think, you know, to Benzie's point, there is a lot of you know, a rift maybe in the unions. And obviously, you know, it was a big deal for Ford to pick up some support from organized labor, especially unions that would typically maybe support the Liberals, construction unions, I'm thinking. But there is like this interesting swing of blue collar voters who are more likely to switch between NDP and Conservative. And I think that was something that was significant in the Southwest region for sure.
All right, I want to talk about another storyline that I think has been sort of overshadowing the election here is voter turnout. One of the lowest rather in Ontario's history. Robert, does this taint the PC victory at all?
Well, I mean, it is what it is, Dan. Kathleen Wynne, there was 48% voter turnout in 2014. Did that taint her majority win with 38 point whatever percent she had that year? No, I mean, people had the chance to vote. And they should have gone and voted. I mean, it's not a great look for Elections Ontario. I mean, to have that turnout that low, it's kind of on them. It's on the parties as well, I suppose. But I think I see a lot of talk this morning from academics and others blaming the media, blaming the coverage, blaming the political parties, blaming the leaders. But I mean, sometimes people are complacent because they don't feel anything is wrong, and so they just said, well, you know what, I'm not going to bother to vote because I thought I don't have a huge issue with them. In 2018, we had 57% voter turnout, and that was a change election to get rid of Doug Ford. So 4 years from now, if it's a change election and it's throw the bums out, we could see an increase again, like to those previous levels. I think this one is complicated for lots of reasons. The pandemic has made people kind of insane, and some people just didn't bother. They've kind of withdrawn into themselves. I guess they'd rather spend their night on Twitter complaining about how awful the world is than actually going out and doing anything to change it by voting. But it's depressing. I mean, there were 7,000 polling stations in 124 ridings, and there weren't lineups at most of them, and that's not a good look for Ontario. So I think we as a society have to ask ourselves why that is.
All right, Sabrina, I'm hoping you can break this down for me. We've been talking a lot in this election, post-election, about seat efficiency. The Liberals only won 8 seats, but their voter turnout was almost identical to the NDP at about 24%. How is this possible?
Yeah, I think this might spark a lot of conversations about electoral reform and our system, but that kind of seems to happen. It will really go anywhere. And of course, the powers that be aren't exactly willing to change the system that got them to the top spot there. But I think, of course, just a devastating night for the Liberals. Didn't get party status. I guess for close Queen's Park watchers would know that they did get enough to get the former threshold for party status, which was 8 seats. And obviously, being recognized in the House as an official party, as they say, comes with a lot of added benefits. Of course, you get more resources. There's more money to hire research staff, help you just kind of do your legislative duties. And obviously, that went a long way for the NDP. Of course, I think they couldn't really turn it out, use those resources effectively enough to grow their opposition. Obviously, we saw last night, hindsight is 2020, but these parties will still get a per vote subsidy. So that's this quarterly taxpayer funded subsidy that all the parties get once you meet a certain threshold of the vote, and they will use that, and that will go a long way. But certainly, I think this is going to have a lot of interesting debates, especially even for the Greens too, about if our system is really cutting it versus something like proportional representation.
All right, I want to talk about resignations. One that maybe we all saw coming, one that maybe we didn't think it was kind of up in the air. But we'll start with Andrea Horwath. Robert, she announced her resignation last night. There's a lot of questions about who will be stepping up. Who do you think will lead the NDP next?
Well, I mean, we've already written story today about who some of the names that are being bandied about. Marit Stiles, the Davenport MPP, very effective opposition MPP. She's former president of the federal New Democrats. She's formidable. Catherine Fife from Waterloo, another top-notch performer. Dolly Begum from Scarborough Southwest. Wayne Gates from Niagara Falls. There's no shortage of names that are swirling around and Joel Harden from Ottawa Center. And I think it's because, to Sabrina's point, it's a prize. You're going to be the leader of the official opposition. It comes with a nice pay packet of about $180,000 a year and the perks of that office. And you could be the government in waiting, because we know that Ontarians tend to give premiers a 2 kicks at the can. So there's a good chance that next time to 2026 could actually be a change election. So if you're, I'm going to be watching the people jockeying for that race, because that's going to be a really lively contest. Andrea Horwath has been leader since 2009. She took the party from the place where basically the Liberals are now, frankly, to official opposition status. But Dan, she should have probably quit in 2018 when she'd taken them to the precipice at 40 seats, because they would have probably been better positioned last night than they were. Sometimes it's better to leave a party 5 minutes too early, or 4 minutes too early, or 5 minutes too early than 4 years too late,
I do want to get your take. You've been following, the legislature for quite some time, and I'm curious. Her speech, we saw a different side of her in that speech, an emotional one. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously an upsetting thing for her, because she has rebuilt that party. I think I understood where she was coming from. On a human level, you see that the hard work that these folks do. And it must have been distressing after 4 years of sitting across from Doug Ford, who she doesn't think very highly of, obviously, otherwise she wouldn't have been running against him, to see him romp to victory, especially winning so many NDP seats. What did they win? 9 NDP or 8 NDP held seats? I mean, that's a big chunk of support to lose. And then on the other side, Stephen Del Duca, who I've known for very many years since he was a political staffer, bright guy, capable guy. And watching his speech, Jan, I saw a side of him that you don't often see. I mean, he was deeply, deeply hurt by what happened, and I understand that. I'd seen him the day before, and he had said he was going to stay no matter what happened in his own riding on Friday or on Thursday. And then, the reality was he just couldn't stick around if they weren't in official party status of 12 seats. So they're now looking for a leader, and they're unlike the NDP leadership. It's not going to be as many people who are interested, because it's kind of not a poison chalice, but it's not exactly a plum. They don't have official status in the House, so they're going to be treated as 8 independent MPPs. So that's going to be tough.
Sabrina, I want to get your take on that. Unlike the NDP, they don't have a number of candidates waiting in the wings. Who do you think might be the next Liberal leader? And more importantly, who would want the job?
Yeah, this one's a little bit different than the NDP, right? I think what I was hearing last night from Liberals was that the absolute lowest bar, getting those 12 seats for recognized status, was what Del Duca could do. I think some were even willing to keep him around. There's an automatic leadership review in the party post-election. Like, if he had done that, he didn't manage to hold on to his seat. He didn't manage to get official opposition. They were kind of willing to forgive that. But it was just like a really brutal showing for them, especially, ridings that they thought they had in the bag, St. Paul's, for instance. But there are already some rumors about who would take, his spot potentially. I think in the last leadership race for the Liberals, it wasn't that long ago in 2020, Del Duca kind of won that handily. Like, it wasn't even close with the others. And so there has been some buzz about Mitzi Hunter, but, she placed far behind in the last leadership race there. So I don't know if she would make another kick at the can. I'm also hearing Mary Margaret McMahon, who won in Beaches East York, managed to take that seat from the NDP. Some rumors that I've been hearing is that if she did run, she might get endorsed by Del Duca's team, and one Liberal insider said that would be poison to her. I think there's a lot of hard feelings about how last night went in that party, especially. And of course, elections are emotional things. Like, we as reporters have been watching it. It's like super exciting for us. And I can't imagine being an actual partisan person, like how intense it is. So a lot of buzz. I think, as for Horwath and Del Duca's future, they might have, both of them might have municipal bids. The timing kind of works out where they could run for their city councils. Horwath kind of opened the door to that this week. And the same time, Mauricio Bevilacqua, the mayor of Vaughan, said he won't be running again. So, I think there's going to be a lot of questions for Del Duca if he'll try and run again there.
All right. I want to move into some ridings. Robert, Doug Downey, the former Attorney General, narrowly held on to his seat last night. Do you think that means the position of Attorney General is now up for grabs?
Well, I mean, in the sense that they do have others who could be Attorney General. Todd McCarthy, who was elected last night in Durham, is one name that's been mentioned. But Doug Downey's been a pretty effective Attorney General, certainly better than his predecessor, Caroline Mulroney, who struggled in that role, frankly. You're speaking about the Liberal race, Jan. Jeff Lehman, who was the Liberal candidate against Doug Downey as the mayor of Barrie,
right.
It was a close one, and he was if he had won last night, I would have put him as the front runner to be the next Liberal leader, because he's been bandied about in that role before. Now, having lost to the Attorney General, I doubt that he'd be interested anymore. But you never know. Never say never in politics. There are lots of second acts in politics. It's not like F. Scott Fitzgerald said about American lives. But I think the fact that it was such a close race is not going to hurt Mr. Downey's chances for being back in cabinet, because he was actually one of the more effective ministers. You remember when the government was doing that boneheaded move about having police spot checks and closing the playgrounds to limit COVID-19 back in April 2021, last April, a year and a month ago. Doug Downey was one of the voices of reason at the cabinet table, who said, "Are we sure we want to do this?" And I think Doug Ford appreciated that counsel, and especially since events proved Mr. Downey to be correct.
All right, I want to talk about the Mike and Matt show. Unfortunately, Sabrina, that did not come to be. Mike Schreiner, though, maintained his seat, but they were hoping to get some love in Perry Samuskoka. Again, a close race, but they were going up against a well-known municipal politician there. Are the Greens a viable party when they can only get one person elected?
Look, I think like unlike what we saw with the NDP and the Liberals, the Greens can still call last night a victory for them. I believe that Mike Schreiner won Guelph, by the biggest margin of last night. Of course, there's still it's just early numbers right now, but that's something to be proud about for sure. And of course, he had made history in 2018 by being the first ever Green MPP elected. So holding on to that seat was a big victory for him. Parry Sound Muskoka, we were saying about Andrea Horwath, the fourth time is not the charm, and so for Matt Richter over there, the fifth time was not the charm. It was his fifth run, but he ended up kind of doubling his vote share there. He got about 20% in the last round in 2018. He got about 40% this time around, and so I think they're still feeling pretty good, the Greens, but yeah, their chances of forming government are virtually nil, of course, at this point. We always like to say about Mike Schreiner that he punches above his weight as, the sole Green there, as an opposition member who holds the government accountable. And I think that we'll continue to see that in the House.
It'll be interesting. Matt Richter, of course, that was, I believe, so maybe he's going for 6. Now, that the election is over, I don't want to jump 4 years from now. I want to focus and turn on, now that we've gone from campaigning, let's go into governing. Are there any things that you guys are going to be keeping your eyes on? Are there any stories that you anticipate that will be unfolding? Robert, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching for the cost of living. Affordability issues were big in this election. As much as anything was big. I'm going to be watching for Premier Ford to keep some of these campaign promises. He made a lot of very expensive promises. He's already the biggest spending premier in the history of Ontario. The reintroduced budget later this year will probably be more than $200 billion. It was $198.6 billion on April 28th. I think it's going to be higher by the time it's actually tabled again. And the deficit might be, exceed $20 billion, and it was $19.9 billion before. So he's a big spender, and he's going to have to keep some of those promises, because if 4 years from now, opposition leaders are standing in front of empty fields saying Doug Ford promised a hospital here, or Doug Ford promised a highway here, or Doug Ford promised a subway here, and nothing has happened, people are going to remember that, and I think his team is mindful of that. They know that they have made a lot of promises to a lot of people, and they have been in many ways all things to all people, and almost everything except, I would argue, climate change. That was really their one most vulnerable issue, and for whatever reason it didn't hurt them. But they have made a lot of promises, and keeping those promises will be interesting to see. With inflation at 7%, boy, it's going to be expensive and it's going to be tricky.
Sabrina, I got 30 seconds. What will you be keeping your eyes on?
Yeah, I'm with Benzie. I'll be seeing if they can really follow through on some of these promises. Now the work of governing begins. They've got this huge majority mandate. What are they going to do with it? Obviously, the opposition parties are going to be busy for the next little bit with picking their own leaders. That could, take years sometimes. And so I think, really keeping a close eye on Ford, what he's doing. He's already kind of walking back some of the budget promises that he made. And so I think keeping a close eye on that is going to really fall to reporters more than ever now.
Robert, Sabrina, thank you so much for your insights. Make sure to get some rest.
Have a good night.
Thanks.
Voters spread across more than 1 million square kilometers went to the polls yesterday. And while we all know the big picture now, for some regional perspective on what the voters said, we're joined by, in Thunder Bay, Charnel Anderson, who covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs, in the nation's capital, Ontario Hubs editor Sarah Trick, and in the Hammer, Justin Chandler, who covers the Hamilton-Niagara region. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, Jen.
Hello there.
All right, Charnel, I want to start with you. Last night, Doug Ford said, if you're a miner in the north who's out of work, I want you to know we're building that road to the Ring of Fire. Why the nod to the north?
Yeah, I think, well, as Erin Kelly said on the show last night, this wasn't an election about issues. And I think that's clear when you look at the campaigns. All 4 parties sort of had a lot of similar promises for the north, from, the Ontario Northland to the Ring of Fire, to highways. But I think, the PCs have been more aggressive on some of these issues, like the Ring of Fire, which as you say, Doug Ford mentioned in his speech last night. And, he famously said that he'll hop on a bulldozer himself in order to get it done. But first, there needs to be a highway going up there. And of course, there's been objections from a number of First Nation communities whose territory that road would run through. So, I expect some of those issues, some of those disagreements to continue. And then another big project in the region that the PC support is the widening of Highway 17 from Kenora to Manitoba. And so that's something that Greg Rickford, who won his seat in Kenora, Rainy River, fairly comfortably last night, he's championed the widening of Highway 17 since his time as an MP in 2009. And, the Ford government awarded a contract to begin work on that earlier this year. So I think we'll see more progress on that as time goes on.
Very nice. Well, let's head over to Justin. The NDP, they lost a number of seats, and I'm curious, what does a re-elected PC government mean to the Hamilton-Niagara region?
Well, one big thing that I'm going to be curious about, and I know a lot of people in town will be wondering about, is the urban boundary decision that Hamilton City Council made. They decided that instead of expanding the urban boundary, they are going to freeze it and intensify development within the city. And that's something that the PC government has sort of said that, maybe that doesn't go with what we want. So there's some speculation that potentially they could overturn that decision. And that's something the other parties all said that they were not going to do that. The PCs have kept it open, with Donna Skelly saying she was the former sitting member in Glanbrook, who won her seat again yesterday. But she has said that it's something that they're going to wait and see more to determine what Hamilton's plan is and what the party wants to do.
All right, and then Sarah, Ottawa residents, some of them have been rather disappointed with Doug Ford recently. Tell us about that.
Well, Jan, as you know, Ottawa's had a fairly challenging 6 months. In the beginning part of the year, there was the Freedom Convoy, which was very difficult for downtown residents as they tried to navigate their daily lives. Just recently, we had a storm that left the majority of the city without power. And I believe there are still some that don't have power back yet. And during this crisis, there's been a sentiment throughout Ottawa that Doug Ford's government doesn't really care about Ottawa residents, that perhaps they don't see people in Ottawa or they don't see Ottawa as a real place or as their responsibility. They seem to see it as federal territory. Whether or not that is true or fair, I can't comment on, but I do know that I see this. I see the sentiment among the residents of Ottawa. That being said, Ottawa has re-elected several PC MPs last night, including two former cabinet ministers.
All right, we'll delve into that sentiment a little later on in the program. So let's get into the results, because there are some interesting storylines, some interesting upsets, and we want to start with Charnel. Gilles Bisson spent a lot of time, has a lot of history in that riding of Timmins. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there were a couple of big upsets in the north, and I think the biggest surprises based on the parties that won these ridings historically are in Timmins and Thunder Bay Atikokan. So over in Timmins, Gilles Bisson was the former sitting member who represented the region for 30 plus years through, I think, 3 different iterations of the riding there. He was originally elected in Cochrane South in 1990, and most recently in the last election in the riding of Timmins. But last night, Bisson lost his seat by a fairly large margin, over 5,000 votes, to PC candidate George Pirie, who was serving as the mayor of Timmins. And besides that, it was a pretty tight race in Thunder Bay Atikokan. That riding's been red going back to its creation in 1999. And Bill Morrow, who is now Thunder Bay's mayor, represented that riding for a long time until 2018, when the NDP's Judith Monteith-Farrell took it with only 81 additional votes. So it looked like it might be a tight race, and it was, but it was the PC's Kevin Holland, who was mayor of Economy Township just outside Thunder Bay, who took that seat by about 900 votes, or 36% of the vote. And the former NDP member got 32% of the votes, so that was pretty close. And,
I was going to say, very interesting stuff when you look at it. 2 NDP, 2 orange ridings that both flipped to blue. I want to head over to Justin. Some very, very interesting stuff. I want to start off with Haldimand North. They elected an MPP, and I think a lot of people, when they saw the results, probably said, something's wrong here. What happened? But there's a whole storyline. What happened?
Yeah, so Haldimand Norfolk, it was predicted that it was going to be a PC pickup. Ken Hewitt, the PC candidate, was the mayor of Haldeman County, but he ended up running against Bobby Ann Brady. Bobby Ann Brady was a longtime conservative PC party insider. She worked for the previous MPP, Tony Barrett. And when he announced that he wasn't going to run again, he said that she should be his successor. And based on the reporting that I've read about this, the party said, no, we don't want that. And so Bobby Ann Brady decided she would run, and Barrett helped her with her campaign. And yeah, she ended up winning by, I think it was around a couple thousand votes. So a pretty secure victory for her. And it was kind of funny. The Hamilton Spectator had a picture of her holding up a banana. And apparently something that she has said was that a member of the PC team told her that they could run a monkey in the riding and it would win as long as it had the PC logo on its back. So she had that banana on election night in reference to that, to celebrate her victory.
Very, very interesting there. All right, I want to move over to Hamilton East, Stony Creek. Both of us Hamilton guys, so I know this was a race that we were both looking at. Tell us about that. No sitting members in this riding, very close between the top three there. Paul Miller, of course, that's a recognizable face in that riding. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, this is the only other riding in the Hamilton-Niagara area that I was covering that that actually changed hands. So this was previously an NDP riding for a long time. Paul Miller held it, but then there was a schism in the party. Paul Miller was accused of Islamophobia and ousted from the party. He has said that that's not the case. He's denied that. He's actually suing the party. So there was some drama there. The NDP ran a candidate, and they ran against a current city councillor, Jason Farr, and against Neil Lumsden, who was a Hamilton Ticat and a bigwig football player, a Canadian Hall of Famer. And it ended up being that Lumsden won. So this longtime NDP seat is now a PC seat, and that's the only one in Hamilton that changed hands.
All right, I want to move to Ottawa. Sarah, earlier we talked about the sentiments there in that region, how voters showed last night, and we'll start off with Ottawa Centre.
Well, Ottawa Centre is interesting. It was supposed to be a seat that the Liberals could pick up that was in contention. At very least, it was going to be a close fight between Joel Harden of the NDP and the challenger Katie Gibbs of the Liberals. As you can see there, it was not a close contest at all. Harden cracked 30,000 votes and may have had more votes than any other MPP standing for election last night.
And we know that Joel Harden as well is potentially a name that's being thrown out as a potential NDP leader contestant there. And I want to talk about another riding that we've been watching, a close race between the NDP and PCs in Ottawa, West Nepean. Tell us about that.
Well, although the NDP did lose several seats to the PCs, this was actually one that they picked up. Chandra Pasma of the NDP took the seat from Jeremy Roberts of the PCs. These two actually contested last time as well, where Jeremy Roberts won by 175 votes. This time, Pasma won by 900 votes.
And were there other ridings in the area that you were keeping a close eye on?
Yes. In Kingston in the Islands, Ted Sue of the Liberals took the seat for the Liberals from the NDP after the NDP, the former city member for the NDP, decided not to run again. As well, in Glengarry Prescott Russell, Amanda Simard of the Liberals, who was actually a former Conservative, lost the seat to a Conservative challenger. She had been a member of the Conservative Party before, left caucus and was an independent, and then joined the Liberal Party. So the PCs were able to take that seat back.
All right, so I want to take a step back and bring everyone in. Charnel, I'll start with you. Are there any big takeaways from the election in your specific region and what we can expect in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so another riding that I wanted to point out is Thunder Bay Superior North, which was also a pretty close race last night. So that was Michael Gravel's seat, and he's represented the riding for over 2 decades. But unfortunately, he's been having some health problems, and so he decided not to run again, which I don't think was an easy decision for him. And so, as I said, in 2018, Thunder Bay Superior North was a close race between Liberals' Michael Gravel and NDP's Lise Vaudois. And last night, again, close race, but Vaudois won with 800 votes.
And Justin, any key takeaways from the election?
Yeah, well, despite there only being a couple ridings that flipped, there were some very close races. The riding that I live in, Hamilton West, Ancaster Dundas, the former sitting member Sandy Shaw held her seat for the NDP, but the margin was not as wide as last time. And in Niagara Centre, there was only an 850 vote difference between the first place NDP candidate and the second place PC candidate. But I guess just the main thing I would say is overall voter turnout was pretty low. The highest voter turnout in the area was in Niagara West, and that was only something like 52%. A lot of it was in the 40s or 30s. And as we know, Ontario saw the lowest voter turnout in history. So that's definitely notable.
Seems to be the big story from the election. Sarah, any last takeaways from the election for your region?
What's interesting about Ottawa and the surrounding areas is that all the parties actually managed to make some pickups last night. We have some representation from the PCs. We have an NDP pickup and the NDP keeping their seats. And then we have a Liberal pickup as well. 4 out of the Liberals' 8 seats are in Ottawa and Kingston.
Very interesting stuff. Sarah, Charnel, Justin, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight and for your insights.
Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, Jan.
Sure. In this final week of campaigning, the agenda looked at why education and childcare weren't discussed as much as they have been in past elections, and heard from former cabinet ministers on what this campaign was about. The agenda's week in review begins reflecting on the rise of some of the new parties on the right of the political spectrum.
Ginny, I wanted to get your take on, we've talked a lot about New Blue during the course of the campaign. They've got most of the attention because the Karahalioses, they do tend to attract attention. They're an interesting couple. They had a seat in the last legislature, not elected to it, but Belinda Karahalios, when she was kicked out of the PC caucus, joined and created this New Blue party. But I noticed on television the other day, the Ontario Party of Derek Sloan's they've got commercials out there now. And there's an Ontario First Party and a Libertarian Party that's been around for a while. And, there's still a Trillium Party that's out there, which also is a right-wing party. There are a lot of right-wing alternatives in this province right now. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about what you think is driving the emergence of all of this.
Yes, well, I think those splits are important to note, right, for political outcome purposes. I said at the beginning that I don't think there's going to be much of a political outcome that's relevant, that's driven by the growth of the New Blue. And partially that's because people on the right who want an alternative to the Ford PCs, that effort is kind of split amongst all these different small parties. And they all seem to be sort of single issue or single message parties that, frankly, the other point I'd make is it's really hard to mount a political party and increase your name recognition and get into the media and get out in front of people. New Blue is doing the best job. They have the most candidates nominated. They have a sort of semi-coherent policy platform. The others are sort of vanity projects, I think, for their leaders who are not doing a terribly good job of increasing their name recognition. And so that vote's splitting. But I think part of why they're stuck on one or two issues, particularly COVID, which a lot of people are over now and don't want to think about anymore, is because, yes, I just want to get back to this Ford positioning question. Yes, he's sort of center moderate on economic issues and material issues, where Sean's right, the left really has kind of vacated and moved further to the left and left him that room on the center. But the other piece in terms of these union endorsements and these sort of the kinds of people that are the union members, because I think, by the way, the thing that's driving these union endorsements is their membership, and the leadership's catching up to the membership, not the other way around. The leaders want to be where their members are. And the reason those members are with Ford, for the most part, is because culturally, he does have some pretty conservative touch points on crime, building on his brother's legacy of sort of the tax piece of the fees piece that Martin was talking about around stopping the gravy trade and the Ontario public and the kinds of people who are members of these unions, they want to make sure hospitals are built and highways are built and the province is spending on the things that they want the province to spend on. But they also want a government that's going to be tough on crime. They want a government that's going to, and a leader who kind of speaks to them, but uses their language, which Ford is very good on. So it's not as simple as this left-right spectrum. And that's, I think, why you see this fracturing of these parties on the right, because there's no one theme or there's no broad grouping of policies they can seize on that Ford has vacated on the right, because it doesn't really exist.
Let me suggest a theme here. Martin, let me get you to play with this one if you would. Belinda Carr-Halios was kicked out of the PC caucus. She started Rick Nichols was kicked out of the PC caucus for refusing to be vaccinated. He's now running for the Ontario Party. Derek Sloan was kicked out of the federal Conservative caucus. He's now the leader of the Ontario Party. How much do you think revenge is behind the creation of all of these new right-wing parties?
Well, connect the dots. It's funny that they didn't form these ideological cause or cri de coeur until they were kicked out and had nowhere else to go, had to leave the sandbox and build one all themselves. So yes, that's the motivation. Revenge or a reprise, let's say. I think you forgot that Randy Hillier, who was flirting with setting up his own party as well until he got into so much trouble over COVID, anti-vax, convoys, anti-everything, that he kind of fell apart. So absolutely, it is about it's personal, and it is also anti-vax, and in that sense, it is anti-science. Jenny talked about how it was partly in later stages that people were wondering, well, why do we have these restrictions? But remember, these parties formed when the science was most compelling. Science changes, by the way, as new evidence comes along. But when we didn't think that COVID could be transmitted if we could get vaccinated, and that would stop transmission, that's when the vaccine passports were brought in. Until further notice, a new variant, Omicron, etc. So that's part of it. But they created their own sandboxes. But guess what? Now New Blue can't play well with others, and as often happens in any ideological, even religious atomization, fractures, different denominations. And so if you look at that New Blue's website, you'll see he's attacking the other parties personally. He goes after Randy Hillier for secret conspiracies. He goes after Derek Sloan for secret conspiracies. It's all over the map. They can't play well with others, and it's except with his own wife and the wife with husband.
I think it's important to remember it's called the Education Quality and Accountability Office. So EQAO doesn't stand for the test. It stands for, supposedly, which we could quibble about, an arm's length office that has the capacity to think about assessment, overall provincial assessment. So I would argue, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, but definitely, as Kelly said, a rethink, definitely, as Tony said, looking at sampling. That's how PISA works. We believe that from all over the world. We do sampling in Canada when we compare provinces. You don't need, it's just like polls in an election. You don't, every single person doesn't have to participate to understand where the sort of general success is. I think it's also important that we understand all the different sort of layers of assessment that happens. And we've been looking at what provinces and territories are doing across the country in terms of looking at the impact of the pandemic. And some provinces are doing a lot more interesting stuff or putting more into the mix when they're trying to understand the overall impact. They're looking at, kids' report cards, they're looking at student surveys, and in some cases, and at standardized tests. But again, we've got this office. Let's repurpose it so that we have really great research about what's going on in our system. And for me, especially in all of this, not just now, but into the future, because we've got to be able to hold both those things in our minds. Yes, recovery. What about renewal? What about going forward?
Caroline, the clock has caught up with me here, and therefore I'm going to deprive you of the opportunity to comment on this. But I'm going to ask you to comment on what I think is the big overarching question of this campaign, which is the almost complete, apparent lack of voter interest in education issues as reflected in the public opinion surveys. We hear housing, we hear affordability, to a lesser extent climate change. Education is not cracking the top 3 or 4 or 5 issues in this campaign, despite what the last 2 years have provided. Why do you think that is?
That's such a great question, Steve. And I wish I had a good answer to that. Maybe everyone's just tired. That's what I can come up with. If you remember before the pandemic, we had teacher negotiations led into work to rule and teacher strikes. Those contracts were only signed in March and April 2020, just as the pandemic was was washing over Canadian shores here. So I think, people have just gone through one set of upheaval after another in education. And, coming out of this election, teacher contracts and education worker contracts are expiring at the end of August. So we're going to have another round of negotiations in front of us. So perhaps, people are exhausted. That's all I have.
Well, that's not bad, actually. Okay, Annie, what do your antennae tell you about why this has just not been a big campaign issue at all?
Well, beyond that, it's really depressing that it isn't. I think that it tells us something, and maybe Caroline's right, we're all just tired of everything. I'm not sure how engaged people are in the election, in fact. But I think what it tells us is, and what we have to remember, is that education itself has kind of isolated itself from the world. So people who care about education have not done a good job connecting education to all of those other issues, to jobs, like making that clear link between jobs and education, between health and education. Education is the #1 determinant of health, but we're not very good at making that clear. So I think it should be a wake-up call to all of us who care about public education to do more and better in terms of a communication strategy, laying the groundwork to say that public education is actually probably the foundation of all of these other issues of democracy, of citizen engagement, of a thriving economy. But we definitely haven't done that right now. So it's really easy for everybody to see education as an issue for teachers and for parents. And why should I care? I don't have kids in school.
Did the deal between the feds and the province basically remove childcare as a political/election issue because everybody thinks this is solved now?
Yeah, well, I think that is the case. I think that Ford's holdout, made our victory a little less sweet, and I think that was the intent, to hold out, to sign the agreement, and then move on and not have it be a topic of discussion, because really there's no plan in place for how we're going to get there. So I do think that was the strategy there, check it off the list and move on and not have it be a topic of discussion. It absolutely should be an election issue. The pandemic in the past 2 years have really served to magnify the importance of childcare and the need to build this Canada-wide system, but we really don't have any of the specifics and we need to be talking about it. And I really do hope that when people are going to the polls that even if they don't need childcare themselves, they know that their colleagues do in order to get to work. And it is a vital and critical service that we need to expand in a really mindful and thoughtful way.
Adrienne, what do you think? Why has this not been a bigger election issue?
Yeah, I think it's very surprising that we've heard more about, expanding or making available an optional grade 13 than we have about the biggest investment in early years learning ever. And that's not to, put aside the disruptions that students have experienced over the last 2 years, but we know from, an educational equality perspective, grade 13 only does so much. Where we see the huge investments in learning, where we see equality of opportunity gains, is when we invest in early years. And so it's really surprising to me that we haven't seen this politicized more, particularly because, parents are still holding the bag on having to pay childcare fees. Most parents I know haven't seen any of the money in terms of retroactive payments that were supposed to come before the election. We saw the provincial government drag its heels on negotiating, and that's had real sort of affordability concerns for parents even to today. So it is surprising to me that it hasn't come up more, given sort of both the fact that we have a lot to do on this file moving forward, as well as the uncertainty that parents are still experiencing.
In fact, Carolyn, Stephen Del Duca did an event in Oakville this morning at which he explicitly pointed out that the Liberals would make those payments retroactive back to January. We mentioned that earlier in this discussion. and that, to the best of his knowledge, no parents had received those retroactive payments which the current government promised to do. So why hasn't childcare been a bigger issue in this campaign?
Yeah, well, I think that Athena, when you said that the government signed just at the deadline, and that kind of made it a non-issue. That's exactly what we heard from all of the other parties. When we reached out to them, childcare is going to be there in our platform, but because there's not such a big contrast between us and each of the other parties, it's not going to be a huge issue for us. But I think that even if it's not being discussed, it's certainly a big issue for parents. And that, as you said, Steve, the fact that no parents have actually received, lower fees at this point, I think that is an issue because, of course, Doug Ford, when he signed that agreement at the end of March, he promised parents that they'd start to see lower childcare fees in May, and that hasn't happened. Right.
And May's over.
I think it was an irresponsible promise to make. It was a promise made and a promise broken. So I think that should stick to them. The other thing I'd say really needs to stick to the Conservative Party is, if we look back over the past 4 years, sure, they signed that agreement in March, but they were dragged to the negotiating table kicking and screaming. It was months. We were the last province to sign on. And their record over the last 4 years on childcare has been, pretty lacking in ambition.
Well, let the record show we have not ignored childcare on this program, and which is why we wanted to have the three of you on to discuss it. And Carolyn, if you can do it in 10 seconds, because you have the province-wide view on this thing, what letter grade do you want to give the PC government for the last 4 years on childcare?
Well, I guess they would get, last semester because they signed the agreement, but only, just on the deadline. But if I'm looking over the past 4 years, it's a failing grade.
John Snoblin, once upon a time, was the Minister of Education in the province of Ontario, and he looked something like this. Sheldon, if you would.
I like to say that in those days, not very long ago, when Betty Stevenson was the minister, our job in education was to prepare young people for the future. And now we have an additional burden as educators to prepare the future for our young people. And so it's a different burden, really.
So the first question is, don't we both look so much better today? No, that is not the first question. The first question is, what was this election about anyway?
Well, that's been the big question for 29 days. I think that the political parties are oddly detached from where people are. I know, probably like my colleagues tonight on this panel, that we've been going door to door, and the big issue for people is affordability. It's the dominant. It's kind of like when the alligators come in the pool, you quit thinking about swimming, and everything else is on the side. And right now, it's $2 a liter gasoline and the food prices, and that's the issue. And to the extent that political parties have spoken to it, they can connect to people. If they don't, they can't.
Once upon a time, Frances Lankin was a cabinet minister in Ontario, and she was a pundit on a previous program we did together on TVO. And that went something like this. Sheldon, again, if you would.
What's happened in the last week has been really fascinating as the Conservative campaign has gained popular ground, which it has. No one can deny that. In fact, it's not a horse race at this point in time. They're in the lead.
Well, we talked about elections then. We're talking about elections now. What do you think this campaign's been about, Senator?
Well, I would agree with John in terms of where people are at. Now, I don't go door to door anymore. I'm an independent, so I don't engage in partisan politics, but I am surely a keen watcher. I have found this election to be lackluster, boring, frustrating. And there's a lot of reasons. I mean, some of the issues are the issues that we've talked about in every election for I don't know how many decades. And I'm frustrated that we're not making progress. But the other thing I would say is that, the issue of the economy, John's right, that's, costs, how we're going to get through this is on people's mind with all the weight of the post-pandemic anxiety and polarized politics. But that's not something that a province in and of itself can fix. So there's a mismatch between, a bus ride, buck a bus ride, and the actual stuff that is worrying people and what will fix it for people. So there are limited tools the province has. I get that, and I think that shows through in terms of the commitments that the parties are making right now.
Once upon a time, Greg Sorbara was the finance minister in the province of Ontario. Sheldon, if you would.
This statement really says is that we've got a serious but manageable fiscal problem, and that we're going to work our way out of it, and we're going to ensure that we have the capacity to deliver on those improvements in public services.
There you were talking politics 19 years ago, and here we are again.
Wow.
What do you think this campaign was about?
Well, I think it's simple, Steve. I think the question is, does the Doug Ford government deserve re-election? And I think, to me, that's the ballot question. And I think the answer is absolutely not. I mean, we have a crisis in our housing industry. We have a crisis in our healthcare system. We have a crisis in education. I remember in the last election, in the midst of the last election, Doug Ford said, "We are going to put an end to hallway medicine." 3 weeks ago, a dear friend of mine's mother was committed to hospital, and she spent the first 4 days in the hallway. What happened to that promise? And we have a crisis with our seniors and caring for our seniors. And as the other said, we have a crisis in the cost of living. And when you add on the inflation that is now infecting the economy, affordability becomes an even greater problem. And there's nothing that the Ford government is promising to do anything about that. So I'd say look at the record. It's not a good record. In fact, in almost every area of public service, it's an abysmal record, and that government does not deserve to be reelected.
That's just some of what we've covered during the last week of the election. You can find more, including the full conversations, on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, June 3rd, 2022. Monday, author Susan Cain on why the pursuit of happiness may not be all it's cracked up to be. I'm Jay Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend. And Steve, day.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.